The wind had a name in Wyoming. It was a patient thief, a sculptor of sorrows, and it never rested. In the summer of 1887, it carried more dust than rain. The dust, fine as milled flour, settled into the grain of the fence posts, coated the parched leaves of the cornstalks, and laid a silken gray shroud over the 2 wooden crosses that stood on a low hill behind Clara's homestead. It was a land of muted colors, where the sky was a bleached blue and the earth was 100 shades of brown. Even the steeple of the church in the distant town of Redemption seemed to wear a film of grit, its promise of heaven dulled by the reality of the ground. Clara May Thompson, a widow of 2 years at 28, knew the dust intimately. It was in the water she drew from the well, in the bread she kneaded, in the lines of her own hands. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life pared down to its essentials. Her world was this small plot of land on the edge of town, a place just far enough away for the whispers to travel on the wind, but not the comfort of a neighbor's voice. She milked her 2 cows, Bess and June, before the sun had a chance to bake the air, her hands working the teats with a practiced, rhythmic pull that required no thought. She collected the eggs from the henhouse, her lips a firm, straight line as she shooed away a broody hen. She churned the butter and baked the pies. Apple, when she could get them. Rhubarb from her own stubborn patch. That kept a roof over her head. Loneliness had not so much broken her as it had compressed her, forcing her spirit into a dense, hard kernel of resolve. She had learned the language of silence, the companionship of the vast, empty horizon. But the town of Redemption never let her forget she was alone. Her husband, Daniel, had died from a shotgun blast in their own front room. An accident, the sheriff had ruled, a cleaning gone wrong. Daniel had been clumsy with drink in his last months, but the story, like a burr on a saddle blanket, clung to her. A woman's hands ought to be gentle, they said in low voices over their sewing circles and saloon tables. A good wife ought to have seen the trouble in him, ought to have been able to soothe it out. The whispers followed her like a shadow she could not outrun, that her hand had not been as steady, her heart not as pure, as a grieving widow's should be. The heaviest judgment came from the one place she was supposed to find solace. Every Sunday, she would harness her old mare to the buckboard and ride into town for the morning service. She would walk up the steps of the Redemption Community Church, her back straight, her bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin, and take her seat in the rearmost pew. She could feel the eyes on her, a physical weight on her shoulders. She could hear the rustle of dresses as women leaned to whisper to their neighbors. Reverend Miller never said her name from the pulpit. He did not need to. He spoke of Jezebel and Delilah, of the wicked woman whose ways lead to ruin. He preached of the curse that falls upon a house where sin is allowed to fester, his gaze sweeping over the congregation before landing, for just a moment too long, on the widow in the back row. His words were stones, and though she flinched inwardly, she never let it show. She attended out of a stubborn refusal to be driven away, a defiant act that felt like the only power she had left. But beneath the defiance, a darker current ran, a cold, hard knot of guilt. Daniel had been a difficult man, and in the dark of night, when the wind howled around the corners of the house, she would wonder if the town was right. Had she pushed him too far? Had some part of her been relieved when the silence fell? The questions were a penance she paid every Sunday, sitting alone in that church. She made her living from the edges of society. The railroad was pushing west, and the crews of tired, grimy men would sometimes stop at her gate, eager for a slice of pie and a jug of cold milk. Drifters, cowboys following the herds north, and families in dusty wagons heading for lands unknown. They were her customers. They paid in coin when they had it, in bullets or salt or a bit of cloth when they did not. She learned to read the men in their eyes, to know which ones were safe and which ones were not. She kept Daniel's old rifle cleaned and loaded above the hearth, a silent sentinel in her quiet home. One evening in late August, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of oppressive quiet that comes before a prairie storm. The birds fell silent. The cows in the pasture stood motionless, their heads low. Clara was bringing in the last of her laundry from the line, the dry canvas sheets stiff in her hands, when she saw him, a lone rider, a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the horizon. He was not moving fast. The horse beneath him favored its left foreleg, a clear, painful limp that slowed them to a walk. She watched, her hand shielding her eyes, as he drew closer. He sat tall in the saddle, but there was a weariness in the slump of his shoulders. As he reached her gate, he stopped and dismounted carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. He was dressed in dusty, trail-worn clothes, denim trousers, a faded flannel shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy with thirst and road dust. He removed his hat, revealing a tangle of dark hair and a face etched with lines of fatigue. He was not old, perhaps 30 or so, but his eyes held the deep, shadowed look of a man who had seen too much. "I'd be grateful for some water, for myself and my horse. He's pulled up lame." Clara's first instinct was to say no. A lone woman did not invite trouble to her doorstep. The sun was setting, and the storm was coming. But she saw the way he stood, his weight off his own left leg, a slight limp mirroring his horse's. She saw the honest exhaustion in his face, not the sly cunning of a man looking for an opportunity. And she saw the horse, a fine-looking bay, its head drooping, its flank slick with sweat. Pity, an emotion she rarely allowed herself, stirred in her chest. "There's a trough by the barn," she said, her voice flat, betraying none of her hesitation. "I'll draw a fresh bucket from the well for you." He nodded, a simple gesture of gratitude. "Much obliged. The name's Eli Hayes." She did not offer hers in return. She walked to the well, the wooden bucket rattling as she lowered it into the cool dark. She worked the crank, her muscles pulling with familiar strength, and brought up a brimming bucket of clear, cold water. He had led his horse to the trough and was running a gentle hand down the swollen leg. He moved with a quiet competence, murmuring to the animal in a low, soothing tone. He drank from the dipper she offered, tipping his head back and swallowing deeply, the water tracing a clean path through the dust on his throat. He sighed, a sound of pure relief. "Haven't tasted water that good in 100 miles, he said, handing the dipper back. "Thank you." The first drop of rain fell then, a single, fat splat in the dust at her feet. Then another, and another. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the west. "That leg will need looking after," she said, nodding toward the horse. "He can't travel on it, and this storm's going to be a bad one." The words were out before she had fully considered them. It was not an invitation. Not yet, but a statement of fact. Eli looked up at the darkening sky, then back at his horse. A flicker of something, worry or perhaps despair, crossed his face before he masked it. "I reckon you're right." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the rising wind and the patter of the first rains. She was a woman alone. He was a stranger. The rules of the world were clear, but the sight of his tired face, the genuine concern he showed for his animal, and the looming violence of the storm conspired against her caution. To turn him out would be a cruelty she was not capable of, no matter how hard she had tried to become. "You can put your horse in the barn," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "There's an empty stall. You can stay there, too, until the storm passes." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He seemed to understand the risk she was taking, the trust she was offering, however grudgingly. "I won't cause you any trouble, ma'am. I give you my word." She simply nodded and turned back toward the small, sturdy house her husband had built, leaving him to tend to his horse. Inside, she lit a kerosene lamp, the soft yellow glow pushing back the encroaching twilight. The rain began to fall in earnest now, drumming a frantic rhythm on the sod roof. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard for a stark, blue-white second, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the very floorboards. She went about her routine, stoking the fire in the cast-iron stove, putting a pot of coffee on to boil. But her movements were jerky, her senses attuned to the presence of the man in her barn. After a while, there was a soft knock on the door. She opened it to find him standing on the porch, his hat in his hands, his hair damp with rain. "I got him settled," he said. "His leg is hot. I wrapped it with a wet cloth. I saw you had a lamp lit. I hope you don't mind. But I brought my bedroll up to the loft to keep it dry." "That's fine," she said. "I noticed you have coffee on," he added, his voice hesitant. "I wouldn't want to impose, but—" She looked at him, standing there in the doorway, a figure of weary politeness caught between the storm outside and the warmth within. Something in his gaze was familiar, a deep, abiding loneliness that she recognized because she saw it in her own reflection every morning. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Sit by the fire and get warm." He entered, bringing the scent of rain and damp earth with him. He moved with a stiffness that suggested old injuries, taking the simple wooden chair she offered by the hearth. The room was small and spare, dominated by the stone fireplace, a sturdy table, and a single bed in the corner. It was a room built for survival, not comfort, yet the lamplight gave it a fragile warmth. She poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one to him. Their fingers brushed, a brief, unremarkable contact that sent a strange jolt through her. It had been so long since she had touched another person with anything resembling gentleness. He cradled the cup in his hands, letting the steam warm his face. They sat in an awkward silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the relentless drumming of the rain. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions. He was a man running from something. She was a woman hiding from everything. "Been a soldier," he said finally, not as a boast, but as a simple statement of fact, as if explaining the stiffness in his joints or the shadows in his eyes. "I figured," she replied, her gaze falling to his hands. They were strong, capable hands, but she noticed a faint, persistent tremor in them, a slight vibration that the tin cup could not quite conceal. It was most noticeable when he spoke of anything that hinted at his past. "Union," he added, as if it mattered. She just nodded. The war was over, but it had left ghosts scattered all across the land. It seemed he carried his with him. He looked around the small, tidy room, his eyes lingering for a moment on the rifle above the mantelpiece before settling on her. "It's a hard life out here for a woman on her own." "Life is hard everywhere," she said, the words sharper than she intended. A flicker of understanding crossed his face. "Yes, ma'am. I suppose it is." The thunder rolled again, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry animal. In the distance, a coyote cried out, its lonely call swallowed by the storm. The sound amplified the feeling of isolation, of 2 small souls huddled together against a vast and indifferent wilderness. Clara found her own eyes drifting toward the window, which looked out over the back of the property. In the brief, strobing flashes of lightning, she could just make out the 2 mounds on the hill, the larger one, Daniel's, and the smaller one beside it. The child she had lost before it had ever drawn breath. The twin sources of her guilt and her town's condemnation. Eli noticed the direction of her gaze. He had seen the graves when he'd first ridden up. A man learned to notice things on the trail. A broken branch, a snake in the grass. The story told by 2 lonely markers on a windswept hill. He saw the way her shoulders tensed, the way her expression hardened into a familiar mask of sorrow. He did not ask. He knew that some questions were an intrusion, a trespass on sacred ground. Instead, he looked back into his coffee cup, granting her the privacy of her pain. The storm raged for hours, a wild tantrum of wind and water. They spoke little, their conversation composed of small, disconnected fragments. He talked of Texas, of the long cattle drives, of the way the stars looked on a clear night in the desert. She spoke of her cows, of the failing crops, of the way the seasons turned in this unforgiving land. They spoke of everything and nothing, circling the raw, wounded centers of their lives like wary animals. They were testing the silence more than the words, finding a strange comfort in the shared quiet. Eventually, the rain began to soften, the thunder retreating into a low grumble on the horizon. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The coffee was long gone. The night had settled into a deep, damp stillness. "The storm's passed," she said, her voice quiet in the small room. "Yes," he answered. He made no move to leave. He just sat there, watching the dying fire. The tremor in his hands stilled for the moment. Neither of them could sleep. The storm had passed outside, but inside them, the tempests still raged. He was a man haunted by the thunder of cannons, and she was a woman haunted by the echo of a single gunshot. They sat in the dim, fading light, two strangers bound by a shared weariness, each seeing their own reflection in the other's guarded eyes. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the weight of pasts they could not escape and futures they could not imagine. They were both afraid, not of the dark or the solitude, but of the flicker of understanding that had passed between them, a fragile, dangerous warmth in the cold and lonely night. To speak of it would be to give it a name, and neither was ready for that. So they sat in silence, by the dying fire, and let the quiet hold them. The world smelled new. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the air washed clean and cool. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and the rising sun struck silver sparks from the damp fence rails. As Clara guided her old mare and buckboard toward redemption, the mud of the road sucking at the wheels, it felt as if the land itself had been given a fresh start. The feeling did not last. As the scattered buildings of the town came into view, the familiar weight settled back onto her shoulders. Redemption did not wash clean so easily. She hitched the buckboard near the general store, her movements deliberate and calm, and began to unload the heavy cans of milk and the basket of pies she had baked before dawn. People were out, assessing the storm's damage. A loose shutter here, a downed branch there. They nodded to each other, stopping to talk in low, neighborly tones. None of them nodded to her. She felt their glances like insects crawling on her skin. Quick and furtive, she was the widow Thompson, a fixed point of gossip in their small universe. Today, she knew, the talk would be worse. The presence of a strange man's horse in her barn would not have gone unnoticed for long. She sold 2 jugs of milk to Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, a man whose transactions with her were always clipped and professional, his eyes never quite meeting hers. She traded a pie to a family passing through, their wagon piled high with all their worldly possessions, their faces weary with the road. It was at the mercantile, while waiting for the storekeeper to weigh out a small sack of flour, that she heard it. The voice was unmistakable, thin and sharp as a needle. Martha Miller, the preacher's wife. She was standing near the fabric bolts with 2 other women of the church, her back to Clara, but her voice carried in the quiet store. "It is a disgrace," Mrs. Miller said, her tone dripping with pious certainty. "A thing of shame for our town, to take in a strange man, a drifter, and let him spend the night under her roof, with no chaperone, no sense of propriety." "Her roof?" One of the other women, a Mrs. Gable, whispered loudly. "I heard he was in the barn. Still, it is not right. Barn, house, it makes no difference." "Mrs. Miller countered, her voice rising with self-righteous fervor. "We all know what kind of woman she is. She has no shame. They say she barters with those railroad men for more than just coin. If you take my meaning, a pretty face and a loose virtue are all the currency some women need." The word struck Clara with a physical force, a hot, shameful slap across the face. Her cheeks burned, a tide of crimson rising up her neck. Her first impulse was to turn, to confront them, to let loose the torrent of rage and hurt she kept dammed up inside her. But she knew it would do no good. It would only confirm their vision of her, a hysterical, shameless woman. So she did what she always did. She stood perfectly still, her spine rigid, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden floorboards. She endured it. She let their poison wash over her, and when the storekeeper returned with her flour, she paid him, took the sack, and walked out of the store with her head held high, her face a pale, cold mask that betrayed nothing of the fire raging within. As she rode home, the clean morning air felt tainted. She saw not the beauty of the plains, but the harshness, the judgment in the unblinking eye of the sun. She had grown a thick skin over these past 2 years, a callus on her soul. But there were days, like today, when the words still found a way to cut through to the raw, tender place beneath. Eli had not been idle. The moment he saw her leave, he had taken stock of the place not as a guest, but as a man who understood the constant battle against decay that was life on the prairie. The storm had loosened a section of the corral fence, and the great wooden door of the barn hung crooked on a single hinge. He found a post-hole digger and an axe in the lean-to, and set to work. He was a man who was comfortable with labor. There was a simple honesty to it, a directness that soothed the restless noise in his head. He dug a new hole for the fence post, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. He split a new rail with practiced, powerful swings of the axe, the clean scent of pine filling the air. He worked without a shirt in the growing heat of the day, the sun warming his back. His body was a map of his life. A long, puckered scar ran down his side, a relic of a Confederate bayonet. A patch of skin on his shoulder was shiny and tight from an old burn. These were the marks of war, of a life lived hard, but the work was a kind of prayer, a way of repaying the small kindness she had shown him. It was a way of building something, however small, in a world where he had seen so much torn down. Clara saw him as she topped the last rise before her homestead. He was hammering the barn door back into place, his back to her. The sun gilded the sweat on his skin, highlighting the taut lines of muscle in his shoulders and arms as he swung the hammer. The sight made her pull back on the reins, stopping the mare in its tracks. A feeling, sharp and wholly unexpected, shot through her. It was a jolt of pure, physical awareness, a warmth that spread from her belly through her entire body. It had been years since she had looked at a man and felt anything but fear or resentment. She had buried that part of herself, the part that could feel desire, alongside her husband. She had believed it was dead. Now, watching this stranger, this quiet, wounded man mending her broken things, she felt it stir. The feeling was terrifying. It was a betrayal of her grief, of the role the town had assigned her. She quickly looked away, urging the mare forward, her heart thumping a wild, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. When she pulled the buckboard into the yard, he turned, wiping his brow with the back of his arm. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice easy. "Thought I'd make myself useful." "You didn't have to," she said, her own voice sounding strained to her ears. She busied herself with the flour sack, avoiding his eyes. "A man ought to earn his keep," he replied simply. He stayed. His horse's leg needed time to heal, and the unspoken truth was that neither of them was in a hurry for him to leave. The days settled into a new kind of rhythm. He would rise with her at dawn, helping with the milking, his large, gentle hands surprisingly adept. He repaired the leaky roof of the chicken coop, reset the stones of the walkway, and tilled the hard soil of her vegetable patch. He worked with a silent, steady competence that she came to rely on. In the evenings, they would sit on the small porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. The awkward silence of the first night gave way to a tentative conversation. He began to talk, not of the war itself, but of the time before. He spoke of a farm in Ohio, of green hills and a brother named Samuel who was 2 years younger and a foot taller. "He was the brave one," Eli said one evening, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. His hands, she noticed, beginning their slight tremble, I was always the cautious one, but when the call came, he was the first to sign up. I followed to look after him. He fell silent, his throat working. I came back. He didn't. The words were bare, stripped of any drama, but they carried the weight of a wound that would never heal. He never said where Samuel had fallen, or how. He did not need to. Clara understood the geography of loss. She, in turn, found herself speaking of things she had not given voice to in years. She told him of her parents, who had died of fever on the wagon trail west, leaving her an orphan in a land that had no place for one. She spoke of her dream, once, of having a small schoolhouse, of teaching children to read. They were small, fragile confessions, offered up like shy birds into the vast twilight. One afternoon, as they sat shelling peas into a large wooden bowl, he looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "Why do you stay here, Clara?" he asked, using her name for the first time. "In this town, they're not kind to you." She did not flinch from the question. She continued to split the pea pods with her thumbnail, the rhythmic pop a steady counterpoint to her words. "I've thought of leaving, more times than I can count. I could sell this place, take the money, and just disappear. Go to California, maybe, start over where no one knows my name." She paused, dropping a handful of bright green peas into the bowl. "But if I run, it's like admitting it. It's like saying they were right all along, that I am the thing they whisper about." She finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. "This place, this land, it's all I have left of a life that was supposed to be different. Leaving feels like letting Daniel die all over again, and letting them win." He held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and solemn understanding. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low. "The hardest fight is just holding your ground." That night, a different sound broke the prairie silence. It was not the howl of a coyote or the rumble of distant thunder. It was the sharp, angry crack of gunshots, coming from the direction of town. It was a sound Eli knew well. He was on his feet in an instant, his body tensing, his face hardening into a mask of grim alertness. "Trouble," he said, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. "Bandits?" Clara whispered, her heart seizing with a familiar dread. "Sounds like it," he said. He was already moving toward the barn. "Stay inside. Bar the door." "Where are you going?" she cried, following him to the porch. "To help," he said, not even breaking stride. He moved with a sudden, startling purpose, the weary drifter replaced by the soldier. He saddled his horse, the bay now moving without a limp, and swung himself up. He did not have a gun of his own that she had seen, but he did not hesitate. "Eli, don't!" she pleaded. "It's not your fight." He looked down at her from the saddle, his face shadowed in the moonlight. "Maybe not," he said, "but I'm tired of running from fights." And with that, he spurred the horse into a gallop, disappearing into the darkness. Clara stood on the porch for a long time, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the vast silence. She did as he said, barring the door, but she could not rest. She paced the small room, her mind filled with terrible images. An hour passed, then two. The silence from the town was more terrifying than the gunshots had been. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She lit a lantern, hitched the mare to the buckboard, and started down the dark road to redemption. The town was a scene of panicked chaos. People were gathered in the street, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight from windows and lanterns. The front of the general store was a wreck, its door splintered and its windows shattered. She saw Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a handlebar mustache, puffing out his chest and recounting a heroic tale to a small crowd. "They came in, 3 of them, guns blazing," he boomed. "But they didn't count on the law in this town being ready for them. I drove them off, sent them running with their tails between their legs." Clara scanned the crowd, her eyes searching desperately. She finally saw him, Sitting on a crate in the shadows of the blacksmith shop, away from the others, a young boy was holding a lantern up for him. Eli's face was bruised, a nasty cut bleeding freely from his temple down his cheek. His shirt was torn, and he was clutching his ribs. She pushed her way through the onlookers, her lantern swinging. "Eli!" He looked up, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "Told you to stay put." "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "Just some scrapes," he said, wincing as he tried to stand. "They got the drop on the sheriff. I came in through the back, knocked one of them over the head with a sack of sugar, caused enough of a fuss for them to get spooked and run for it." The townspeople, hearing this, turned to look at him. A few murmured their thanks. "You were brave, stranger," Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. But their attention was fleeting. The sheriff, not wanting to be upstaged, cleared his throat loudly and resumed his embellished story. The crowd turned back to him, the official authority, the source of the official story. Eli, the stranger who had actually fought, was left in the shadows with his bruises. He had been a hero for a moment, and now he was just a drifter again. Clara felt a hot surge of anger at the injustice of it. "Come on," she said, her voice firm. "Let's go home. I'll clean you up." She helped him into the buckboard and drove them back through the quiet darkness. Neither of them spoke. The silence in the wagon was different now, charged with a new and complicated energy. Back in her small house, she lit the main lamp, its bright glow illuminating the damage more clearly. The cut on his head was deep, and a dark bruise was already forming on his jaw. "Sit," she commanded gently. Pointing to the chair by the hearth, she fetched the basin of water, a bottle of carbolic, and clean strips of linen. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound on his temple. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew steady. He sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his breathing low and even. The room was silent save for the soft splash of water and the hiss of the lantern. The air grew thick, heavy with their proximity. She could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, smell the scent of dust and sweat and blood. As she dabbed the cut, her fingers brushed against his cheek. He opened his eyes. They were dark, intense, and filled with an emotion she could not name. Her hand froze. They were so close she could see the flecks of gold in the brown of his irises, could feel his breath on her face. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. The town, the gossip, the ghosts of their pasts. It all fell away. There was only the low light, his pained stillness, and the unbearable tension that arced between their eyes. It was a moment stretched taut, a breath held too long. It was a question and an answer all at once, a recognition of the shared loneliness and the nascent, terrifying hope that was growing between them. But they were both wounded creatures, experts in the art of self-preservation. To lean into that moment felt like stepping off a cliff, with a small, sharp intake of breath. Clara pulled her hand back as if burned. She looked down at the basin in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs. Eli looked away, his jaw tightening, his gaze finding the dying embers in the fireplace. The moment was broken. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was heavier than before, filled with the terrifying weight of what had almost happened. They had both seen the cliff edge, and, for now, they had both stepped back. The days that followed were strung tight as a wire. The easy rhythm they had found was gone, replaced by a strained and careful silence. The space between them, once a quiet comfort, was now charged with the memory of that night in the lamplight, of her hand on his face, of the look that had passed between them. They moved around each other with a new awareness, their bodies like magnets repelling just before they could touch. When he handed her the milk pail, their fingers would avoid contact. When she set a plate of food before him at the table, her eyes would be fixed on the wooden grain. They still worked side by side, But the work was no longer a simple partnership. It was a distraction, a necessary chore to fill the hours and keep them from having to face the thing that had taken root in the silence. Clara found herself watching him from the corner of her eye as he mended a harness. The focused set of his jaw, the way his hands, so steady in their work, could tremble when his guard was down. She felt a constant, low hum of anxiety in her chest, a feeling of being on the verge of something she could not name and did not want to. For his part, Eli grew quieter, more withdrawn. The stories of his past ceased. He seemed to be rebuilding the walls around himself, the ones she had just begun to see through. He spent more time with his horse, currying its coat with long, slow strokes. His voice a low murmur only the animal could hear. He was a man poised for departure, and the knowledge of it was a constant, dull ache in Clara's heart. The breaking point came on a moonless, suffocatingly still night. Sleep would not come to Clara. She tossed in her narrow bed, the sheets twisting around her like ropes. When she finally did drift off, the familiar darkness found her. It was always the same dream, a scene replayed with the terrible clarity of a memory seared into her soul. She was back in the small house, but it was colder, darker. The air was thick with the sour, sweet smell of whiskey. Daniel was there, his face bloated and red, his eyes holding a wild, mean glint she had come to dread. He was shouting, his words slurring together, a torrent of accusations about a glance she had given a shopkeeper, about the cost of flour, about her failure to give him a son. The shotgun, the one he was supposed to be cleaning, lay in pieces on the table. In the dream, he was putting it back together, his drunken fingers fumbling with the oily metal parts. He stood up, the gun reassembled, and swayed on his feet. He pointed it at her, not with intent to fire, but with the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed the power of fear. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he sneered, his voice a low growl. "You and your quiet judgments." He took a step toward her, and she backed away, her bare feet cold on the rough floorboards. Her back hit the wall. He was close now, the smell of him overwhelming. The cold metal of the gun barrel inches from her face. He was not just threatening her, he was consuming her, his rage filling the small room until she could not breathe. A primal fear, cold and sharp, cut through her paralysis. She did not think, she reacted. She brought her hands up and pushed against his chest, a single, desperate shove to create space, to get air, to live. He was unsteady, top-heavy with drink. The push sent him stumbling backward. He tripped over the leg of a chair, his arms pinwheeling for balance. The gun, held loosely in his hand, swung wildly and crashed against the corner of the stone hearth. The sound was not a gunshot. It was an explosion, a deafening, world-ending roar that filled the room, the house, the universe. It was followed by a silence so profound, so absolute, that it rang in her ears. Daniel lay on the floor, a strange, surprised look on his face, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. Clara woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in her bed, her body drenched in a cold sweat. The dream's echo was still in the room, the phantom smell of whiskey, the ringing silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. She could not breathe in the confines of the house. She threw off the covers and stumbled outside, gasping for air on the front porch. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she could not stop the shaking. The tears came then, hot and silent, a flood of grief and guilt she had held back for 2 long years. She was not crying for the man he had become, but for the man he was supposed to have been, and for the woman she had become in his wake. She did not hear the soft footfalls behind her. She only knew he was there when a voice, low and gentle, cut through her sobbing, "Clara?" She flinched, turning to see Eli standing in the doorway, a figure of shadows and concern. He was holding a blanket. He did not move closer, did not intrude, but simply stood there, a silent witness. The sight of him, his quiet presence, broke something in her. The story, the real one, the one she had never told a living soul, came pouring out of her. It was a torrent of broken words and ragged breaths. "It was my fault," she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "Everyone, they whisper that I did it. They think I planned it, but it wasn't like that." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "He was drunk. He was always drunk at the end. He was threatening me. With the gun. He said terrible things. I was so scared. I pushed him. I just wanted him to get away from me. He fell. The gun hit the fireplace." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving. "It went off. I never meant for it to happen. But I pushed him. If I hadn't pushed him, he would still be alive. God help me." Some part of me was glad when the shouting stopped. The confession hung in the cold night air, a terrible, fragile thing. She had finally given voice to her deepest shame, and she waited for the judgment, the revulsion, the condemnation she was sure would follow. Eli was silent for a long moment. Then he walked over and gently draped the blanket around her trembling shoulders. He sat on the porch step beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not tell her it was not her fault. He simply listened, his silence a vessel that held her broken story without shattering. After a time, he reached over and placed his hand over hers where it clutched the blanket. His touch was firm and steady, a simple, solid point of contact in her spinning world. It was a gesture of pure acceptance. She looked at his hand covering hers, then up at his face, in the faint starlight. She saw no judgment in his eyes, only a deep, sorrowful empathy. And for the first time in 2 years, she did not feel entirely alone. She did not pull her hand away. The next morning, the fragile peace was shattered by a sharp, insistent knocking on the front door. Clara opened it to find Reverend Miller standing on her porch, his face a mask of grim piety. 2 of his deacons, stout men with self-important expressions, stood a few paces behind him. "Mrs. Thompson," the preacher began without preamble, his eyes sweeping past her to the interior of the house. "I have come to speak with you about the state of your immortal soul." Before Clara could respond, Eli appeared behind her. He had been splitting wood out back and had come to see who the visitor was. He held an axe in his hand, its weight held loosely at his side. Reverend Miller's eyes narrowed at the sight of him. His lips thinned into a line of pure contempt. "And here is the source of the rot," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "I have warned you, woman, about the company you keep. This town will not stand for such flagrant sin. You are housing this drifter under your roof without the sanctity of marriage. You are living in sin, an affront to God and this community. You are on her property." "Reverend," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a step forward, placing himself between Clara and the preacher. He did not raise his voice. He did not lift the axe, but his presence was a wall of silent menace. "You have no right to speak to her that way." "I have every right," Miller boomed, puffing out his chest. "I am a shepherd tending to my flock, and this woman is a wolf among my sheep. I am ordering you to leave this place. Leave this town. Your presence here is a corruption." "The only corruption I see," Eli said, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones, "is a man who uses God's name to bully a woman he knows is alone." He took another slow step forward. "I will not tell you again. Leave her be." The preacher stared at Eli, his face turning a mottled red. He saw no fear in the other man's eyes, only a flat, deadly calm that promised consequences. Miller was a man used to wielding power through words and public shame. He was not a man of physical courage. He sputtered for a moment, then gathered his dignity like a cloak. "You will regret this," he hissed, turning his venom on Clara. "The Lord will not be mocked. You have chosen your path, and it leads to damnation." With a final, hateful glare, he turned and marched away, his deacons following in his wake. The consequences were immediate. That afternoon, when Clara rode into town for supplies, the whispers were replaced by open glares. In the mercantile, the storekeeper served other customers first, leaving her to stand and wait for a full 10 minutes. When he finally addressed her, his voice was cold. The story had already spread, twisted and amplified by the preacher's righteous fury. By evening, a new rumor had taken root. The stranger, Eli Hayes, was not just a drifter. He was a deserter from the army, a wanted man, a thief who had fled a warrant in Kansas. The lies were ugly, and they were effective. That night, they came. She and Eli were sitting in the quiet of the house when they heard the first thud against the outside wall, then another, and another. It was the sound of stones, small at first, then larger. Clara rushed to the window and peered out into the darkness. She could see them, shadowy figures at the edge of her property, their arms moving as they hurled their judgment from a safe distance. Eli pulled her away from the window. "Do not let them see you," he said, his face grim. The stone throwing continued for half an hour, a sporadic, cowardly assault, before the figures melted back into the night. When it was over, a heavy silence settled in the house. Eli stood by the hearth, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. "This is my fault," he said, his voice raspy. "I should have left the morning after the storm. I have brought this on you." "No," she said, her voice fierce. "This is not you. This is them. This is what they do." "It does not matter," he said, turning to face her. His eyes were filled with a terrible resolve. "They will not stop as long as I am here. They will make your life a living hell. Or worse. I have to go. Clara!" The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. The thought of being alone again, truly alone after this brief, fragile reprieve, was more than she could bear. All the strength she had cultivated, all the walls she had built, crumbled in that instant. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Please, do not go." "I have to," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "It is the only way to protect you." "Protect me?" Her voice broke, rising with a desperate, ragged edge. She took a step toward him, her hands clenched at her sides. "For 2 years, I have been alone. I have listened to their whispers. I have felt their stares. I have borne their judgment, and I have done it all alone. And then you came. You fixed my fence, and you listened to me. You did not look at me like I was cursed." Tears streamed down her face, but she did not bother to wipe them away. "I do not want your protection. Eli, I want you to stay. Please, I am asking you to stay." Her plea, so raw and vulnerable, stripped away his resolve. He looked at her, at the tears carving paths through the dust on her cheeks, and saw not a woman who needed saving, but a woman of incredible strength who had finally reached her limit. The distance between them vanished. He crossed the room in 2 strides and stood before her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Clara," he breathed, his own voice thick with emotion. She looked up into his eyes, and everything they had held back, the fear, the loneliness, the desperate, burgeoning need was laid bare. Her hands came up to rest on his wrists, holding him there. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hesitant, trembling, born of pain and desperation. It was a question asked in the dark, a collision of 2 lonely souls who had forgotten the language of tenderness. His lips were chapped, tasting of salt and sorrow. Her response was a small, broken sound, a sob and a sigh all at once. For a moment, it was all trembling uncertainty. Then something shifted. The desperation deepened into a current of undeniable need. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against him, and she clung to him, her fingers digging into his back. The kiss changed, becoming a raw, searing expression of everything they could not say. It was a promise to hold on, to stand against the dark, to simply be present. Outside, a sudden wind rattled the window panes, and the first drops of a new storm began to fall. A soft drumming that grew into a steady, pouring rain. They stood in the center of the small room, holding each other as if they were the only two people left in the world. The sound of the rain a wild chorus to their silent, human despair. The gray light of morning filtered through the window, merciless and clear. The rain had stopped, leaving the world sodden and still. Inside the house, the air was thick with a smoky residue of guilt. The desperate connection of the night had vanished with the darkness, leaving behind a raw and awkward silence. Clara moved about the kitchen, stoking the fire, measuring coffee into the pot, her movements stiff and unnatural. She could feel his eyes on her, but she could not bring herself to meet his gaze. What had felt so necessary in the dark now felt like a terrible transgression in the light of day. She had proven the preacher right. She had confirmed every ugly whisper the town had ever uttered. The shame was a physical weight, a sickness in the pit of her stomach. She heard him moving behind her, the soft scuff of his boots on the floorboards. He was gathering his things, his bedroll, his saddlebags. He was packing. The finality of the sounds was like a knife twisting in her gut. She wanted to turn around, to scream at him to stop, to repeat her desperate plea from the night before. But the words would not come. Her own guilt held her captive, silenced her. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this was the only way. He came and stood by the table, his bag in his hand. "Clara," he started, his voice low. She kept her back to him, staring at the small flame licking the bottom of the coffee pot. "You should go before the sun is all the way up," she said, her voice flat and empty. "The road will be easier before it gets hot." He was silent for a long moment. She could feel him wanting to say more, but he respected the wall she had put back up between them. "Take care of yourself," he said finally. She gave a small, jerky nod. She did not turn around. She could not bear to watch him walk out the door. She heard his footsteps, the creak of the door opening, and then the soft click of it closing behind him. Only then did she allow herself to move. She walked to the small window and watched as he untied his horse, swung himself into the saddle, and rode away without a backward glance. He was a small, dark figure moving against the vast, empty canvas of the dawn, growing smaller and smaller until the barren, wind-swept hills swallowed him completely, and she was alone again. The silence Eli left behind was a living thing. It settled into the corners of the house, seeped into the floorboards, and became Clara's constant, unwelcome companion. The weeks that followed his departure were a study in cruelty, both human and divine. The sky remained a vast, indifferent sheet of pale blue, empty of clouds. The sun was not a source of life, but a tormentor, a brassy eye that baked the cracked earth until it was hard as pottery. The corn in Clara's small field turned yellow, then a brittle, skeletal brown. Her vegetable patch withered, the leaves of the squash plants curling in on themselves like fists. One of her cows, Bess, went dry, her ribs showing like washboards beneath her hide. The well water level dropped, and what she drew up tasted of mud and despair. The drought was a slow, relentless tightening of a fist around the throat of the land, and as the land suffered, so did its people. Redemption grew mean. Hope shriveled along with the crops, and in its place, suspicion and blame took root. Fights broke out in the saloon over imagined slights. Neighbors who had shared bread now argued over stray chickens. The town's collective anxiety needed a place to fester, a target for its fear, and Clara remained the most convenient one. Her isolation, once a source of pity and whispers, was now seen as proof of her otherness, her curse. Her weekly trips to church became a trial of faith and endurance. The moment she stepped through the doors, a hush would fall. The women would pull their children closer, their face pinched with disapproval. The men would stare, their gazes a mixture of contempt and a crude, unwelcome curiosity. She would walk the gauntlet to the back pew, her head held high, every step a declaration of war against their judgment. Reverend Miller, emboldened by Eli's absence, made her the centerpiece of his sermons. He no longer needed to be subtle, with the drought as his evidence. He painted a vivid picture of a righteous God withholding his mercy from a community that harbored a sinner in its midst. "The skies are brass above us," he thundered one Sunday, his fist striking the pulpit. "The earth is iron beneath our feet, and you ask why? You ask, 'Lord, why have you forsaken us?' I tell you why. Because there is wickedness among us, a serpent we have allowed to dwell in our garden, a stain upon the soul of this good town. God does not reward a community that turns a blind eye to immorality. He demands a cleansing. He demands we cast out the source of the rot, lest we all perish in the dust of our own tolerance." His eyes, burning with feverish conviction, found hers in the back of the church. The entire congregation turned as one to look at her. In that moment, she was not Clara Thompson, a woman grieving and struggling to survive. She was the curse, the reason for their empty bellies and dying cattle. She was Jezebel. She was the witch they could blame for the failure of the rain. She sat motionless under the crushing weight of their hatred. Her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She stayed until the final hymn was sung, her voice silent, then walked out into the punishing sun, feeling more alone than ever before. The tangible threat came one night in a hellish orange glow on the horizon. From her porch, Clara watched as the sky to the east pulsed with unnatural light. It was a barn fire. Then another. The bandits who had robbed the general store had returned, but not for money. This was an act of terror, a message. They were reminding the territory who held the real power. For 2 nights, she watched the distant fires, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. They had burned the Miller Farms barn, and the Hendersons. They were working their way around the edge of the town. Her homestead was on that edge. She knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that they would come for her. She was the perfect target, isolated, unprotected, and a woman the town had already cast out. No one would come to help. She spent the next day in a state of grim preparation. She checked the load in Daniel's rifle, her hands steady. She boarded up the back window of the house. She filled every bucket and basin with water from the low well. But as night fell again, the futility of her efforts pressed in on her. She could not fight off a band of armed men alone. To stay was to wait for her own destruction. A desperate plan formed in her mind. The nearest town with a real lawman, a federal marshal, was a place called Laramie, 2 days' ride to the west. It was a fool's errand, a long and dangerous journey for a woman alone. But it was better than sitting here, waiting for the flames. As the moon rose, a pale, useless sliver in the dark sky, she made her decision. She packed a small bag with dried beef and a canteen of water, saddled her mare, and slid the rifle into its scabbard, with a last look at the small, lonely house that was her entire world. She rode out into the vast, dark plains. She rode through the night, pushing the mare as hard as she dared. The landscape was a world of shadows and whispers, the familiar hills rendered strange and menacing by the darkness. Every rustle in the sagebrush, every cry of a distant night bird, sent a jolt of fear through her. By dawn, she was exhausted, but she was miles from redemption. She let the horse drink from a shallow, muddy creek and chewed on a piece of tough jerky, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The ambush came in the late afternoon, in a narrow, rock-strewn arroyo. She had been so focused on the open plains behind her that she did not see the 2 riders until they were upon her. They emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, their horses blocking the path ahead. They were rough men, their faces grimy with dirt and stubble, their eyes hard and predatory. She recognized them from the wanted posters that had been nailed up in town after the robbery. "Well now, look what we have here," the first one said. A slow, ugly grin spreading across his face. A little lamb, all lost and alone. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her hand to remain steady as it moved toward the rifle. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, ma'am," the second man warned, drawing a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. "We just want the horse, and maybe a little company for the evening." The first man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He started to ride toward her, his hand outstretched. "Get down off the horse, nice and slow." Terror gave way to a cold, hard fury. She would not be a victim. She would not let these men take everything from her. She pulled the rifle from its scabbard with a speed born of pure desperation. She was not a practiced shot, but she knew how to point and fire. She leveled the barrel at the first man's chest. He stopped, his grin faltering for a second, replaced by a flicker of surprise. Then he chuckled. "She's got spirit. I like that." He spurred his horse forward again. Just as her finger tightened on the trigger, a single, deafening shot rang out from the ridge above the arroyo. It was not her gun. The man lunging for her cried out, a strange, gurgling sound, and slumped sideways in his saddle, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. His horse, panicked, reared and bolted, leaving him to fall to the dusty ground. The second bandit stared in shock at his fallen partner, then whipped his head around, searching for the source of the shot. He saw a figure on the ridge, a man with a rifle, a silhouette against the harsh afternoon sun. With a curse, the bandit wheeled his horse around and dug his spurs into its flanks, fleeing back the way he had come. For a moment, all was silent, except for the frantic pounding of Clara's heart and the sound of the retreating hoofbeats. She stared at the dead man on the ground, then lifted her gaze to the figure on the ridge. He was starting to ride down the steep incline, his movements sure and steady. He was thinner than she remembered, his face leaner, carved into sharper angles by hardship. His clothes were ragged, and a fresh, livid scar cut a path from his right temple down to his jaw. But she knew him. It was a knowing that went deeper than sight. "Eli," she breathed, the name a prayer, a sob, a question. He rode up to her, his horse stopping beside hers. He did not smile. His face was a mask of grim relief. His eyes ached with a weariness that seemed to have settled into his very bones. "Clara," he said, his voice raspy, as if he had not used it for some time. "Are you hurt?" She could only shake her head, unable to form words. She was trembling so violently she was afraid she would fall from the saddle. He reached out and placed a hand on her arm, his grip firm and grounding. The simple touch was enough to break her. A wave of uncontrollable shaking overtook her, a reaction to the terror she had just survived. "It is all right," he said, his voice softening. "You are safe now." He looked at the body on the ground, his expression hardening again. "We need to get out of here. His friend might come back with others." He took the reins of her mare and led them away from the arroyo, leaving the dead man to the sun and the scavengers. They rode in silence for over an hour, climbing into the rolling, barren hills that bordered the plains. He seemed to know where he was going, navigating the rocky terrain with an unerring sense of direction. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, he led them to a place of refuge. It was an old mission chapel, a small, adobe structure half hidden in a grove of stunted junipers. It had long been abandoned. A portion of the roof had collapsed, and the wooden cross that had once topped its small bell tower lay on the ground, broken in two. He helped her dismount, her legs so weak they could barely hold her. Inside, the chapel was filled with shadows and the scent of dust and decay. Pews lay overturned, and moonlight streamed through the hole in the roof, illuminating a film of dust on the stone floor. Eli found an old iron candelabra near the ruined altar and lit the stubs of a few remaining candles. The small, flickering flames pushed back the darkness. creating a small island of fragile warmth and light. He turned to her, and in the soft candlelight, she could see the full extent of the changes in him. He was harder, leaner, a man who had been stripped of everything but the absolute essentials. But his eyes, as they met hers, held the same deep, quiet understanding she remembered. And with that look, the dam of her composure finally broke. The fear from the ambush, the misery of the past weeks, the profound, aching loneliness of his absence, it all came rushing to the surface. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry, not with the silent tears of her porch, but with great, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. I thought you were gone forever," she choked out between sobs. "I thought I would never see you again. And then today, I was—" Eli did not speak. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she wept. He was all hard angles and taut muscle, but his embrace was a sanctuary. She buried her face in his dusty shirt, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. He simply held her, one hand stroking her hair, letting her cry until the storm of her grief had passed. When her sobs finally subsided into exhausted shudders, she looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "Why did you come back?" she whispered. His expression was tender, his eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen in him before. "I tried to stay away," he said, his voice low and rough. "I rode north, thought I would head for Montana, but it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. Every time the wind blew, I heard your voice." He took a deep, ragged breath. "I could not forget you, Clara, even when I tried." His confession was as raw and broken as hers had been. In the flickering candlelight of the ruined church, they were no longer a widow and a drifter, no longer defined by their pasts or the judgment of others. They were just a man and a woman, wounded and weary, who had found a desperate, undeniable solace in each other. He lowered his head, and this time, when he kissed her, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of profound and searing tenderness, a reunion of souls as much as bodies. It tasted of dust and tears, of loss and of finding, of a desperate human need to feel connected in a world determined to tear them apart. They clung to each other, two small flames against the vast, cold night, as if the walls of the ruined chapel were the only thing holding back the darkness of the world. The shattered cross lay outside in the dirt, but inside, in the candlelight, they had found their own fragile, unholy sanctuary. But sanctuary, like the night, could not last forever. Dawn came, a thin gray light seeping through the broken roof, paling the candle flames. Clara awoke in the circle of his arms, a feeling of peace settling over her for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. But one look at his face told her it was over. He was awake, staring at the growing light, and the grim, hard mask of the soldier was back in place. He felt her stir and looked down at her, his expression grim. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent, "there is something you need to know. The man I shot yesterday, I have been tracking his gang for weeks. They are the ones who have been burning the ranches." "I know," she said, sitting up. "I thought they were coming for me next. That is why I was riding for Laramie." "They are planning more than that," he said, his eyes dark with the gravity of his words. "I overheard them at their camp a few nights ago. They are not just trying to scare people anymore. They are angry. The sheriff has put a bigger bounty on them, and they blame the whole town." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "They are planning to ride on redemption tonight. They are going to burn it all to the ground, every last building, including the church, to make an example of it." The fragile peace of the morning shattered. The warmth of their reunion was instantly chilled by the cold hand of fear. The town that had scorned her, the church where she had been condemned, they were now facing annihilation, and she and the man beside her were the only ones who knew. "We have to go back," she said, the words a statement, not a question. He nodded, his jaw tight. "We have to warn them. We will have to ride hard to make it back before nightfall." The ride back to redemption was a silent, frantic prayer against the sun. They pushed their horses hard, the animals' flanks lathered with sweat, their hooves kicking up plumes of the fine, pale dust that seemed to be the land's only crop. Clara rode with her gaze fixed forward, the grim line of her jaw set against the wind. The tender, fragile peace they had found in the ruined chapel was gone, burned away by the urgency of their mission. Beside her, Eli was once again the soldier, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his body a study in tense readiness. They were a unit now, bound not by whispers and stolen kisses, but by a shared and terrible knowledge. They reached the edge of town in the late afternoon, when the sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. Redemption looked just as they had left it, simmering in the heat, its people moving with the slow, weary gait of those who had forgotten what it felt like to have hope. A few men loitered on the porch of the saloon, their faces shaded by the brims of their hats. Women swept dust from their porches, a futile gesture against the encroaching plains. The sight of Clara riding into town alongside the man who had been run out sent a ripple of consternation through the street. Porch conversations stopped, faces turned. Windows that had been empty now held watchful eyes. Eli pulled his horse to a halt in front of the sheriff's office, the most central and official point in town. He did not dismount. He sat tall in his saddle, his presence commanding attention. Clara stayed beside him, a silent and resolute partner. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the scent of confrontation. "I have a warning for this town." Eli's voice rang out, clear and strong, the voice of a man used to giving orders. It cut through the afternoon lethargy. "The bandits who have been burning the ranches are planning to attack Redemption. They mean to burn it to the ground, tonight." A murmur went through the crowd. It was not a murmur of alarm, but of disbelief and suspicion. Sheriff Brody emerged from his office, wiping grease from his mustache with the back of his hand. He squinted up at Eli, his expression a mixture of annoyance and contempt. "Now what is this nonsense?" the sheriff grumbled, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "You again. I thought I told you to get out of this town." "This is not nonsense," Eli said, his voice level, betraying no frustration. "I have seen them. I have heard their plans. They are camped in the Cimarron Hills, and they will ride at nightfall." From the edge of the crowd, a new voice emerged, sharp and righteous. "And why should we believe the word of a liar and a deserter?" Reverend Miller pushed his way to the front, his face flushed with holy indignation. He pointed a trembling finger, not at Eli, but at Clara. "Do you not see the poison she brings among us? First, she drives her husband to his grave. Then she takes up with this vagrant, flaunting her sin before God and all of us. And now she returns with him to spread fear and lies, to turn us against each other in these trying times." "He is not a liar." The voice was Clara's, and it was so sharp and clear that it shocked even herself. Every eye in the crowd swiveled to her. She had never spoken up, never defended herself, never met their judgment with anything but silence. The sight of her, her back straight, her eyes flashing with a fire they had never seen, stunned them into a momentary quiet. "This man saved my life," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The bandits you dismiss ambushed me on the trail. He fought them off. He is here to help you, to warn you, and you stand here calling him a liar because this preacher tells you to." She turned her furious gaze on Miller. "You use God as a weapon to frighten people, but you are nothing but a bully who preys on the weak. You are the poison in this town. Reverend, not me." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was blasphemy. The widow, the sinner, had not only spoken, she had accused the man of God himself. The shock quickly curdled into outrage. The crowd, which had been merely suspicious, now turned hostile. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His face was a mask of official authority, but Clara saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. He was a man trapped in his own lie, forced to play a part. "That is enough out of you, woman. And as for you," he said, looking up at Eli, "I am giving you one final chance. Ride out of this town now, or I will arrest you for disturbing the peace, for vagrancy, and for the murder of a man found dead in the arroyo west of here." The threat hung in the hot, still air. The crowd surged forward, their faces twisted into a unified mask of anger. They were a mob now, their fear and prejudice ignited by the preacher's words and sanctioned by the sheriff's authority. "Get out!" a man shouted. "We do not want your kind here," another yelled. The sentiment was echoed by a dozen other voices, a chorus of hate directed at the two people who were trying to save them. Clara looked at the faces in the crowd, women she had known her whole life, men who had once tipped their hats to her. She saw no reason, no compassion. She saw only fear, a raw and ugly thing that had turned them into strangers. And in that moment, she knew they were lost. Eli looked down at her, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was no use. They would not be warned. He turned his horse, and with Clara beside him, they rode slowly through the hostile crowd, the jeers and insults following them like stones. They did not ride out of town. They rode to her homestead, to the one small patch of ground where they could make a stand, and they settled in to wait for the night. The sunset was beautiful. It was a cruel irony that the sky, which had withheld rain for so long, would put on such a spectacular display of crimson and gold on the eve of the town's destruction. As the last sliver of light disappeared below the horizon, an unnatural quiet fell. The insects were silent. The air was heavy, pregnant with violence. The attack came with the suddenness of a lightning strike. It began not with a shout, but with a bloom of orange against the dark canvas of the night. A torch arced through the air, landing on the dry roof of the livery stable. The shingles, parched and brittle, caught instantly. Within moments, the building was a roaring inferno. Then came the gunshots, a ragged volley from a dozen rifles at once. The bandits rode into the main street, whooping and firing their guns into the air and into the flimsy wooden storefronts. Panic erupted. People who had been jeering a few hours earlier were now screaming, running from their homes, their faces illuminated by the spreading flames. From the small hill of his homestead, Eli watched for a moment, his face a grim, stony mask. "Stay here," he told Clara, his voice low and commanding. "Bar the door. Use the rifle if you have to." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her heart seizing with fear. "What I should have done in the first place," he said. He slid his own rifle, a heavy military-grade weapon she had not seen before, from its scabbard on his horse. "Try to get some of them to higher ground." He swung into the saddle and, without another word, rode down into the inferno. Clara watched him go, a lone rider charging toward the chaos. He did not ride into the main street. Instead, he circled around, using the darkness and the buildings for cover, his soldier's instincts taking over. She saw him help a family out of a burning house, pointing them toward the creek. She saw him pull a man, wounded, from the street, and drag him into the relative safety of the blacksmith's stone shop. He was not fighting for the town that had rejected him. He was fighting for the people, for the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. The fire spread with terrifying speed, leaping from building to building, driven by a rising wind. The general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office. They were all consumed by a vortex of flame and black smoke, the air filled with the roar of the fire, the crack of splitting timber, the screams of people, and the constant angry popping of gunfire. Then Clara saw it. Through a gap in the smoke, she saw the church steeple, its white paint glowing orange in the reflected light, and she saw the torches. Two of the bandits had ridden up to the church, the last major building untouched at the end of the street. They smashed the windows and threw their torches inside. A cold, sickening dread washed over her. It was not the loss of the building that horrified her. It was the children. The town orphanage, such as it was housed in the church basement. 5 small children, cared for by an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, would be asleep down there, trapped. Without a second thought, she unbarred the door and ran. She ran toward the fire, her skirts catching on the dry brush, the heat on her face so intense it felt like it was peeling her skin. She did not have a plan. She only knew that she could not let them die. The town was a vision of hell. Embers rained down from the sky like angry red snow. She dodged a panicked horse, its eyes wide with terror. She ran past the bodies of 2 men in the street, their forms stark and final in the firelight. The smoke was a thick, acrid blanket, clawing at her throat, making her eyes stream with tears. She reached the church. The main doors were already engulfed in flames. The steeple, that symbol of judgment and piety, was burning, a great, fiery finger pointing at a black, smoke-choked sky. She remembered a small side entrance, a cellar door around the back that led to the basement. She stumbled through the churchyard, the heat from the walls blistering, and found the door. It was old wood, but it was not yet on fire. She tugged at the iron ring, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. The door was stuck. She pulled again, with all her strength, and it groaned open. A blast of superheated air and thick smoke billowed out. She covered her mouth with the fabric of her sleeve and plunged into the darkness below. Eli saw her, from his position behind the blacksmith's shop. He saw a lone figure, a woman, running toward the burning church. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that it was Clara. A cold dread, worse than any he had felt on the battlefield, seized him. He fired 2 quick shots at a bandit who was taking aim at a fleeing family. Then he broke cover and ran, sprinting through the burning street toward the church. He followed her path, finding the open cellar door. Without hesitation, he followed her down into the suffocating darkness. Downstairs, the smoke was thicker, a blinding, choking fog. Clara could hear the terrified whimpering of the children. "I am here," she called out, her voice a raw croak. "It is Mrs. Thompson! Come to my voice!" She found them huddled in a corner with Mrs. Gable, who was trying in vain to shield them. There were 5 of them, their small faces pale with terror, their eyes wide in the gloom. Just then, a heavy footstep sounded on the stairs. Clara spun around, expecting a bandit, but it was Eli, his face smudged with soot, his eyes searching wildly. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. "The children," she gasped. "The stairs are about to go," he said, his voice urgent. "The whole floor above us is on fire. We have to find another way out." A great groaning sound came from above them, the sound of ancient timbers surrendering to the fire. A section of the ceiling collapsed, bringing a shower of fire and embers down just feet from where they stood. The children screamed. "The vestry window!" Mrs. Gable coughed, pointing a trembling hand. "It is high, but it leads to the outside." Eli ran to it. It was a small, high window, barely large enough for a child to fit through. It was barred. He grabbed the iron bars and pulled, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining. The old mortar crumbled, and with a great heave, he tore the grate from the wall. "Quickly!" he yelled over the roar of the fire. "Lift them up to me!" Clara grabbed the smallest child, a little girl named Sarah, and lifted her into Eli's waiting arms. He pushed the crying girl through the narrow opening and out into the night, one by one. They passed the children out through the window. Clara soothed them, promised them they would be safe, while Eli served as the pillar of strength, pushing them to safety. They had just gotten the last child out when a terrifying, deafening sound filled the air, a deep, resonant crack, followed by a scream of tortured metal and a cataclysmic crash. The great church bell, its supports burned away, tore through the burning roof and the main floor, crashing into the center of the basement not 10 feet from them. It hit the stone floor with the force of a meteor, shattering stone and sending a massive wave of fire, embers and superheated air washing over them. The explosion threw them against the far wall. The exit was gone, buried under a mountain of flaming debris. They were trapped. The fire was no longer just around them. It was everywhere. The very air was flame. The roar was deafening. The heat was unbearable. This was the end. In the heart of the inferno, with the world burning down around them, all fear, all shame, all the ghosts of the past were incinerated. There was nothing left but this single, terrible, brilliant moment. Clara looked at Eli, his face illuminated by the flames, his body shielding hers. He was all she could see. She clung to him, pressing her face against his chest, her voice a ragged sob against the roar of the fire. "Please," she cried, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "Just tonight, I need you." He looked down at her, his face streaked with soot and sweat, his eyes reflecting the fire that was consuming them. He saw no fear in her gaze, only a raw, desperate love. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss of ash and fire, of endings and absolutes. He held her as if he could shield her from the flames with his own body, as if their embrace was the only sanctuary left in a world that had turned to hell. It was their first breath and their last, a final, defiant act of life in the very jaws of death. The world did not end in fire. It ended in weight. After the terrible final kiss, the inferno became a physical force, a living entity of immense pressure. The scream of collapsing timber was the last sound Clara heard before the roof gave way completely. In that final, blinding instant, Eli twisted, covering her with his body, making himself a shield. It was not a choice. It was an instinct. His final act of a soldier's duty and a lover's devotion. The weight of the burning church, of the town's judgment, of a lifetime of sorrow, came down upon them, and the world turned to suffocating darkness, roaring noise, and unbearable heat. Consciousness returned not as a light, but as a slow, creeping awareness of pain. Clara's first sensation was of breathing dust and ash, a thick, gritty powder that coated her tongue and clogged her throat. Her body was a map of agony, 100 small fires of burns and bruises. She tried to move, but a heavy, charred beam lay across her legs, pinning her. For a long, disoriented moment, she did not know where she was, or who. The memory of the fire was a nightmare from which she was struggling to wake. Then she remembered Eli. She turned her head, a movement that sent a searing pain through her neck and shoulder. He lay beside her, half covered by the same beam. He had taken the brunt of the collapse. He was terribly still. The gray light of a desolate dawn filtered down through the skeletal remains of the church roof, illuminating a scene of absolute devastation. The world was rendered in shades of ash and charcoal. Smoke, thick and oily, still rose from the smoldering ruins, clinging to the ground like a funeral shroud. Through a gaping hole where a wall had once stood, she could see what was left of redemption. It was a ghost town, a collection of smoldering skeletons and blackened foundations. Here and there, figures moved through the haze, dazed survivors picking through the wreckage of their lives. She saw the blacksmith's shop, its stone walls still standing but its roof gone. The general store was a heap of ash. Further down, she could just make out the remains of the preacher's house. A group of men were standing near it, their hats in their hands. Even from this distance, their posture spoke of death. Reverend Miller, who had promised damnation by fire, had received it. The town was in ruins, a testament to the hatred it had harbored. But some had survived. Life, tenacious and stubborn, clung on. Clara's world, however, had shrunk to the few feet of rubble around her. Eli, she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She pushed at the beam with all her strength, her burned hand screaming in protest, but it would not budge. Eli, please! His eyelids fluttered. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes found hers. They were clouded with pain, but they were his eyes. A small, weak sound escaped her, a sob of relief so profound it felt like a second breaking. Clara, he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. His breathing was shallow, a terrible wet rattle in his chest. She could see that he was broken inside, crushed by the weight he had taken for her. We are alive, she said, the words sounding foolish and hollow in the face of his injuries. We are alive. A faint, ghostly smile touched his lips. It was a smile of immense and terrible peace. I am glad I came back, he whispered, each word an effort that cost him dearly. He coughed, a movement that racked his body with a spasm of agony. You gave me something worth dying for. Tears streamed down Clara's face, tracing clean paths through the soot and grime. Do not say that, she pleaded, her voice breaking. Do not. Help is coming. Just hold on. But she knew it was a lie. They were in the heart of the destruction, and he was fading before her eyes. The light in his gaze was dimming, the vibrant life she had come to know receding like a tide. He had spent his life wandering, a man without an anchor, a ghost haunted by a war he could not leave behind. But in these last weeks, here, in this place of dust and judgment, he had found a reason to stop. He had found a battle worth fighting. He had found her. She reached out her hand, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw through the soot. He leaned into her touch, a final, small movement. His eyes held hers, a universe of unspoken things passing between them in that last, long moment. Then, the light went out. His chest was still. The faint, rattling breath was gone. Eli Hayes, the soldier, the drifter, the quiet man who had mended her fence and her heart, was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. The great church bell, which had marked the hours of her lonely life, lay half buried in the rubble, its voice silenced forever. In the ashes of the church, surrounded by the ruins of a town that had scorned her, Clara was alone with her dead. They found her hours later, a group of men led by Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith. Their faces were grim, etched with the shock and grief of the night. They looked at her, then at the body of the man beside her who had so clearly saved her life, and the last vestiges of their judgment melted away, replaced by a profound and humbling shame. They worked carefully, using levers to lift the heavy beam, and carried her out into the gray, smoky air. The days that followed were a blur of pain and quiet grief. Her burns were tended to by the other women, their hands, which had once gestured in whispers against her, now gentle and careful. Mrs. Gable, whose life she had saved, sat by her bed, her face a mask of gratitude. They brought her food and water and spoke to her in low, respectful tones. The fire had burned away more than just the buildings. It had incinerated the town's petty cruelties, leaving behind the raw, humbled core of a community forced to rely on one another to survive. When she was strong enough to walk, Clara's first task was to bury him. She refused all offers of help. This was a duty she had to perform alone. She chose a spot on the small, wind-swept hill behind her house, next to the grave of her husband. It felt right. These two men, one who had brought her a life of sorrow and one who had shown her a moment of pure, selfless love, would lie side by side, their stories forever entwined with hers. The digging was hard work. The ground was dry and stubborn, and every shovelful sent a protest through her healing body. But the pain was a penance, a focus for her grief. With every scoop of earth, she thought of him, his quiet smile, the tremor in his hands, the way he had listened, truly listened. on the porch that night, the way he had held her as the world burned. She was not burying a drifter. She was burying the only man who had ever seen her for who she truly was. She fashioned a cross from 2 pieces of salvaged timber, lashing them together with a strip of leather from his saddle. She carved his name into the wood with the tip of a knife. Eli Hayes. It was a simple marker for a man whose life had been anything but simple. When she was done, she stood between the 2 graves, a woman caught between 2 very different pasts, and finally, for the first time, looked toward the future. Life began again, not with a grand announcement, but with the small, quiet sounds of rebuilding. The air, which had smelled of smoke for days, began to clear, and the first tentative sounds of hammers echoed through the valley. People began to clear the rubble, to lay new foundations. They were starting over, all of them. When Clara passed through the ruined streets, the whispers did not follow her. The averted gazes were now ones of respect, of a shared and difficult history. She was no longer the town pariah. She was a survivor, a woman who had run into a burning church to save their children. She was the one who had been with the stranger who fought for them when no one else would. Her story, and his, had been forged anew in the fire. One afternoon, as she was surveying the damage to her own property, a section of her fence had been trampled and burned. A small figure approached her. It was a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, with solemn eyes and a smudge of soot on his cheek. It was Thomas, the oldest of the orphans she had helped save. He did not say anything. He simply picked up a post hole digger that was nearly as tall as he was and began to dig a new hole for a fence post. Clara watched him for a moment, a lump forming in her throat. She picked up an axe, its weight familiar in her hands, and began to split a new rail. They worked together in a companionable silence, the boy and the widow, 2 survivors bound by a night of terror and a debt that could never be spoken. The rhythmic thud of the digger and the clean crack of the axe were the sounds of life beginning again. It was a quiet, uncertain, and profoundly hopeful sound. That evening, she stood on her porch as the sun went down. A breeze, the first in what felt like an eternity, stirred from the west, carrying the scent of distant rain on its breath. The sky was awash with color, the same brilliant, heartbreaking beauty as the night of the fire. But tonight, it did not feel cruel. It felt like a promise. She looked out over the vast, endless plains. It was a harsh and unforgiving land. It had taken everything from her. Twice, but it had also given her a gift. It had given her a few short weeks with a man who had reminded her what it felt like to be alive, to be seen, to be cherished. She closed her eyes, and she was back in the heart of the inferno. The roar of the flames, a wild symphony around them. She could feel the solid strength of his arms, the warmth of his body shielding hers, the desperate, final kiss. In that moment, surrounded by death, she had never felt more alive. In that moment, there was no shame, no guilt, no fear. There was only him. There was only now. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves, carrying the promise of the coming rain. The plains stretched endless before her, harsh, beautiful, and alive. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of remembrance. She opened her eyes and whispered into the wind, her voice clear and steady, a final tribute to the man who had given her something worth living for. Just tonight, I remember. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you. So please comment with where you are listening from. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.